Today on Watercolor Abstractions, we'll be talking about optional watercolor supplies. Some conventional, some not so much. Hello again. Today we're going to be talking about optional watercolor supplies, things that will augment the paper and the brushes and the paint that we talked about last time. The first item of your kit has to be a paint palette. And I'm sure many of you have seen these before. They're small well paint palettes. They don't contain a lot of space, especially if you're using a large brush. It's not something that I would advocate. What I like to use are deep well palettes. And deep well palettes give you the room to work with a large area brush, especially if you're going to be working in a large area, such as a sky, a background of some sort. So you have the ability to get into a well, add water, move it around, use a large brush. In this case, this palette happens to belong to my grandchildren. This is my palette. This is something that I made. And again, it gives me the ability of getting a large brush into these wells. I have the mixing area over here so that I can make large quantities. I don't like to make small quantities because then you have a problem being able to match your color up one-to-one, especially if you're mixing special colors. But this is something that I advocate for new students. Very inexpensive. This is just a plastic plate that I got at Target. An ice cube tray. And again, the ability to get into a well. The ability of a large area to be able to mix and make up colors. Between the two of these, $3 or $4. Not a lot of money spent. When you're working on paper, you need to have a solid substrate to be able to put it on to support it properly. Watercolor paper will buckle when it's wet. So what you want to have is a substrate that will accept it, accept the water, and hold it stiff. This is called Homosote. This is a compressed paper. It's a building product that you can pick up at Home Depot or at Lowe's, and you can get it in a 4x8 sheet. I'll show a layout later on how you could cut this down, especially if you want to share a large sheet with a friend. This is an example of paper on Homosote. You put down the paper taped with artist tape all the way around the perimeter. Artist tape is pH neutral. It has no acid in it, and that's something that as you move on you want to make sure that you have absolutely pH neutral products to work with, because otherwise your paper will end up having acid on it and it will end up turning yellow. Some of these items may be obvious to add to your kit, but in some cases people are not sure in which direction to go. In this case, these are water buckets to be able to wash your brushes into. And in this case, I normally carry 3. Most people are taught to have 2, one with clean water and one with dirty water. And you want something that's wide enough and tall enough to be able to get large brushes into. The third bucket that I add ends up taking any water that ends up being dirty that's still on the brush, and I can wash it out in that bucket before I get to my clean water. I want my clean water absolutely pristine. Another item is a spray bottle. Spray bottles you use for water to activate your paint when it's in the palette. And in this case, I like what's called an adjustable spray bottle. It has this top on it, and you can twist on or off to the degree of coarseness of water spray. I like that adjustability because there are times where I want the spray more coarse and in other cases more fine. If you have one that's just on or off, you're stuck with whatever they give you. Toweling paper, again, it may seem obvious, but you're going to want to have large rolls of toweling paper around because you will go through it very, very quickly. Another item that I like to use are called pour cups or mixing cups. They're essentially a spouted ramekin, and they're spouted because I can directionalize where I pour. So I will mix up paint in here, a combination of colors, or it could just be a straight color out of the tube, but I can mix a lot of paint, and this is where you can get into a more opaque use of watercolor compared to a translucent wash. You could use measuring cups. The purpose is the want of a spout to be able to directionalize where you put the watercolor down on your paper. One of the biggest techniques in watercolor is the ability to reserve the white of the paper. And there are different ways to do that. This is called masking fluid. The brand that I like is Winsor & Newton. There are others out there. And masking fluid essentially is liquid latex. And you can pick it up with a rubber cement pickup when it's dry, but when you put it down, any place it's on the paper, the paint cannot get underneath it. We'll get into a lesson down the road as far as how to properly use masking fluid and the purpose of dishwashing liquid in that case. Another item to consider is rubbing alcohol. And in this case, I like to use 91% rubbing alcohol. The more content to it, the more ability rubbing alcohol will push water away. So when I have water that is colored with paint and I push it around, it's not just a straight wash anymore. And it gives me the ability of getting back to the white of the paper. This is what's called brush cleaner. And when you wash your brushes out, there is still paint that gets up underneath the ferrule of the paintbrush. This essentially is a piece of metal. Underneath is the windings and the glue and so on that hold all the filaments of the brush together. And the brush acts as a wick. So that color, that paint will move its way up in here and so on. And down the road, you may have a perfectly clean brush on the outside, but when you wet it, it reactivates that paint and it starts to come out. So if all of a sudden I'm painting with red and I've got green tucked in here, all of a sudden it comes out and it pollutes what I was trying to do with the red. So in this case here, you take a wet brush and you mix it in here, and this soap, this cleaner, actually works its way up the brush inside the ferrule, and it will clean everything that's in there. It will dilute it and it will end up washing out. You go through this a couple of times and you have a perfectly clean brush. The other thing that this will do is this acts as a conditioner, so that when you end up having a round brush per se, it gives you and it maintains that shape that the brush was intended for. Not expensive, about $5, but very, very well worth it to keep it in your kit. These last few items are crossovers for me, being an architect, that I bring into the artist side of me. And the first is the drawing implement. If you like to draw with pencils, get a good quality pencil. In this case, this is Mars Statler. It's an HB, which is kind of a middle of the road as far as hardness to softness. The higher the H ends up being harder, the higher the B ends up being softer. The same thing goes with graphite sticks. You can get these very hard and very soft. And in both cases, these are graphite based. I'm a big advocate for using graphite when you're working on watercolor paper, because the last thing you want is something getting into your paintbrushes. Graphite won't, especially if you have a good drafting brush. And a good drafting brush will get rid of excess dust, whether it's erasures, and in this case here, I'm an advocate of a white vinyl eraser. It will not smear. It'll keep everything nice and plumb as far as the grain of the paper itself. And using a good horsehair drafting brush will end up getting rid of anything. Again, advocating the use of graphite, not charcoal. Charcoal will smear, it will get into your expensive brushes, and then you're going to have a problem. The last item here is what's called an eraser shield. And in this case here, an eraser shield, based on these different voids and shapes and so on, I can go through and I can erase just what I want to. Again, very, very inexpensive item. You can get this at an art store as well. It's called an eraser shield, and you can hold it up. It's almost like priming for paint. Here's a way how to cut down a 4x8 sheet of Homasote into different sizes based on the type of paper that you use. I hope today's video was informational and helpful. In the coming weeks, we'll be putting out new videos that will be putting a lot of these items into action, and you'll have an idea on the intentions that I use them for, and maybe you'll come up with some new ideas yourself. So until next time.